Yeah, so I think we can begin. So I welcome everyone to part 5 of our Kubernetes weekend. And I would like to say this before I start. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, you can do so to subscribe so you'll be getting updates of the video I made and series of our teachings and classes. So today is going to be a special moment because we'll be deploying 5 nodes cluster, or let's say 3 to 5, within 3 and 5 nodes cluster on 5 nodes Kubernetes cluster on AWS, and everything we are doing will be managing it on that cluster. So it's going to be on AWS. So before now, we are using just a single node cluster. So we are using the Docker desktop, and we also talk about using Minikube and other. So we have been using a single node, but today we want to be using a multiple nodes cluster. So and we are going to be doing that on AWS. So let's begin. So the first requirement is having, I need to do this. So the first requirement is having an AWS account. So I'm going to teach us how. Okay. So I'm trying to sign into my account now. So we'll be needing an authorization. Just a moment. Where I get my method. Security. Okay, boom. So here we are in my AWS console. So firstly, we want to start with the creation of our cluster. So once we create the cluster, as we are creating, it's going to take time. So we'll go back to what we have done in the past and what we want to do. So while we go through that, our cluster will have been done creating. Then we continue with with our class. So let me just go back to home. So firstly, if you log into your AWS console, for those that have an account, and if you don't have an account yet, in one of my previous teaching, I taught on how to open AWS accounts and maybe having multiple accounts and go. So if you have interest in that, you can refer to that teaching. So, but then I will just go straight. So if you create an AWS account and go to the home page, so the first thing you need to do is we have to configure our environment. So, and to configure an environment, we need an IAM user. So the first thing is welcome to IAM user. So it's just to create a credentials for us to configure our environment. Maybe we are using VS Code or any other environment that we want to use, and we are going to see that. So now, I have one IAM user, which is this. So this IAM user is what I use in configuring my environment. So after creating this, then so these are our previous class. So these are what we did. So I purposely did not clear this so we can make reference to some. So now if you should check it here, you see that this is one of the cluster I've created, but it's no more there. So if you can see on my VS Code, I have many I have different extensions, and this is the reason why I was able to have all this on my environment. I have many extensions that I installed. If you should look at my extension, I have Kubernetes AWS installed, so it's more or less like easier for me to use my environment because I have the extension that make it works for me. So now let's try to list our user here. So AWS this so AWS I think is list users. Okay, so that's not the command. Just a moment. So I want to list all the users that I have here. Okay. Okay, I think it should be okay. I didn't put I am list users. Yeah, okay. So when I put the I am user, it's listed the users I have in my AWS. So you can see when we go to our console, we see that this is the name Ade, and yeah, so this is the user ID and code. So this user is going to be down after today. So I'll just open it for us to see. So might not be using this again. So that's that. So today let's begin. So before we can use this, we have to have our EKS CLI installed on our system, in which I have done already. So if you want to use that, so you really need to install our EKS. So in AWS, so the command line that we use to install our Kubernetes is the EKS-CTL. So remember when we are using Docker desktop, we said the kubectl. So the what would I call it now? The command that we use in AWS for our Kubernetes is the EKS. So we use the CTL, but I have it already installed on my PC. So I don't want to go much into that now. Yeah, so I want to go into how to create our EKS directly. So there are two methods to do this. Firstly, we can use our console. So if you should go to EKS, which is our Elastic Kubernetes service, and we go there, we can use the console. But I don't really advise using consoles, creating stuff like this. So now there's one that is active here, which is this. So this is the Cluster ARN. We are going to do that. We are going to check it out. So I created this one like 4 hours ago. This is there. So let's go back. I'm just showing us this, how we can create it. So we can create a cluster. Name of the cluster, the version of the Kubernetes that we are deploying, because this is the latest version here as at now. So we're using 1.24. So after we create this, we go to the networking. I don't want to fill this here. So after we do that, we go to this, we configure the add-on, review, then we create our cluster. And at the same time, we will go ahead and create our nodes also, then give it different IAM, different roles and that. So, but those ones, I see it as it's kind of too long for me, like using the console, be clicking. So I don't really use the console in creating this. Rather, I use my command line. Let me just try and delete this. So I use a CLI to create it, in which I'm going to use today, and I advise us to use more of our CLI to create this. So now we want to create, let's say we want to create a 3-node cluster. One will be our master, and we have 2 worker nodes. So while creating that now, so the command we use in creating this, like I said, we use the EKS to create it. And when we are creating this cluster, okay, let me just show you. So if you want to create, just like, okay, EKS CTL create, just like we did in our Kubernetes -l. So you don't really need to cram the command line or cram how it works or like that, you can do what? Create it here. Check the, so when you use the add F key and see this CKS create add-on, this is what this one will do. This is what this one will do. And these are the what? The tags that we, I mean the flags that we have, which we can use to create it. So looking at the command how to use it, say okay, create, then put the command you want to create. Maybe you want to create a cluster, which is this in it. So that's what you are going to do now. So we want to create cluster. So when we want to create a cluster, of course, we are going to give it a name. So create cluster. So let's give it a name. Name, okay, dash dash. Let's add the name flag equals to, what name should we give it? Let's give it Kubernetes weekend. So give it a name. Then the next thing is, which region do you want to create this? If you are well familiar with AWS, you know that we have it in we have different region. I don't want to go more into AWS. We have different region, different availability zone and co. So, but now I want to specify which region do you want to paste. We want, sorry, create this cluster. Is it in the US East 1, US East 2, or is it in Stockholm, or is it in other parts, of the world? So in this instance, at default, most of the time you use East 1, US East 1. But the issue with US East 1 is that there is always issue with its NAT gateway. Sometimes when creating this cluster, you might create it and sometimes we get error. So most of the time, if you want to do yours on this, I advise using ES East 2. So we can use East 1 now for this, and you are going to see, okay, let's just do one. Let's make it a test, and you can check what I'm saying. Oh, that might even take our time. You don't need to, because before it's installed, let's just go back to, we'll just continue. Okay, so now let's add the region. So if you're adding the region, then let's say US is 2. Then, okay, we have already given our cluster a name. So the next thing is how many nodes, because this command line is not just going to create, it's going to create a cluster and all the nodes that we want. So now we want to give it, how many nodes do we want to create? Now let's create 3 nodes. So we are going to give you the maximum and minimum nodes flag. So now let's use the nodes, yes, which is first let's put the minimum, which will be 3, and then we put in the maximum nodes. Yes, max, which should be 5. I think that's good. So it gets creates, we create, this is the name of our cluster, and here is the region that I want it to be created. This is the minimum node and this is the maximum node. So when we are done with the creation, you're going to see. So let's create this. So error was the issue. Okay, so we omitted cluster because ECS creates, what's the command here? Is it an add-on or is it a cluster or this or this? So we omitted that. So let's fix that. ECS creates cluster. So our cluster is creating on AWS. So this might take a little time, but before this, so let's quickly go back to what we are gonna do while we wait this to create. So today we'll be going more into security. So that's where we're talking about our role binding, users accounts, like that is other users accounts, service accounts. Then we talk about security contests, talk about network policies. Then there's one part that I didn't mention in our previous class, which is resource creation. So if you have the time, we can go over that also. So tomorrow, which is going to be the final class, I want us to talk more about networking. And if you have the time, we can just look at probably questions that are in the CKA exams that you might be asked, and we can go through that together. So I want us to really cover a lot. So let's get going. So why this is creating? So let's go to, okay, so if you refresh this, you can see that we don't have any cluster there. But let's try and duplicate this page. Then while this is loading, let's go to our cloud formation to see what is happening in our cloud formation. So this is our cloud formation. So these are the ones I created sometime. Let me try and delete them. Let me delete this. Okay. So, but this is still in progress. Waiting for this. So let's try and refresh if anything will come up. Okay, so while this is coming up, so let's just go back to what we need to do. So it's going to save time. So now let's start with service accounts. So now in our documentation, what is service account? Now, every time when it comes to in the cluster in Kubernetes, most of the time we use much of APIs. And whenever this want to use APIs, we must be able to give it access. We must be able to have a kind of establish a kind of connection. And when we establish that kind of connection, we don't just want everything to know. We want to put everything, like we want to put it under control. So when we want to put it under control, and one of the DevOps rules is to apply the minimum to give the minimum possible and needed access. So you don't just give access to everybody and everything. Let me use it in that way. So users in your Kubernetes also should have limits to what they can do. For example, a developer in the Kubernetes cluster should have a limit to what, if you want to give a limit to what he or she can do in the cluster, and also if you want to give a limit to what other services that you are using want to do, what they are to do in your cluster. So that is where what we know as service account comes in. So remember in our first class, when I was explaining the architecture of Kubernetes, when I was explaining the Kubernetes architecture, I'm talking about the API server, which is the one responsible for authentication and authorization. So there is two differences between authentication and authorization. So authentication is who is using this, who are you? So who are you is the question of authentication. And what are you doing is like the authorization. So now I ask you that, okay, now who are you? Okay, I'm a developer. What can you do here? So maybe as a developer, you can only create persistent volume claim. You can't create persistent volume, which is right. A developer cannot create a persistent volume. You can only create a persistent volume claim, and you can only list the persistent volume that are there. So it doesn't have the right to what to write. So all these things are being used in the role. And when you are creating the role, okay, sorry, I've not gotten to role. So all these had been done in what when it comes to what security in general. Sorry. So now on where I want to talk about service account. So service account, its main objective is to provide identity for a process that will be run inside the pod. Now, when you are running it, when your pod is running, and you want to interact with that pod, you want to know who are you. Do you have the access to interact in that pod? Do you have the privilege? That is where this service account comes in. So they say a process inside the pod can use the identity of its associated service account to authenticate the cluster API server. You remember when I was talking about it, I said the API server is the one who is responsible for authentication and authorization. So once you send your request, it will go to the API server and see, okay, this person have this access role, this person can do this person can do this person cannot do this. We said no access. We will give back the report that you can do this, you can do this. So now, when you are creating a service account, you can either create a service account or add a service token that you can use. So, and whenever you want, and this service account, like the way we create our persistent volume and our persistent volume claim, or our secret or our config map, you have to mount this service account on each of the pod. Because if you create a service account and you didn't mount it on the pod, there is no way the pod is going to know which service account is using. If there is no service account that is created, the pod is going to use the default service account that is being used. So I'm waiting for this cluster to create. So everything we'll be doing will be on the cluster. Else we just use our one node cluster. Let's see what's happening here. Okay, sorry. I'm in US1. So I was surprised. So you can see I'm in US1 region and I created it in US2 region. So that's why I'm unable to see anything there. So don't forget. So let's switch to US2 region. So now you can see our Kubernetes weekend cluster is what's created in progress. Yeah. So let's wait for that. So let's go back to our service account. So when it comes to management of service account, we can create a token API request for our service account. And we can also mount the service account. We can mount it as a secret. I think, okay, let me do. Okay. So we can mount it as okay. So when we create our service account, I want to demonstrate it, but I don't know if I should use this one cluster as this is being created. Okay, let's wait for this to create so I'll be able to demonstrate it. What I mean. So when we create our service account itself is just like the way we create our namespace. Just like we create our namespace, then we put something in it. Whenever we create our service account, then we have to create what we call, that will lead me to the next principle, which is the role. So that is the role-based authentication, which is this. Let me go to this role-based access control. So when we create our service account, then at the same time we need to create a role and a role binding. So the role we are creating is this is the access. Maybe in this access, what you have to do is to list pod or list service. And when you create that role, you bind it. That's what I'm saying might be in abstract, but I will demonstrate it once this is up. So there's something we call role. Okay, even before I go, okay. So this role we are talking about works inside a namespace. Whenever you create a role, it's going to be inside a namespace. So role can work inside a namespace because it can be isolated. But there's another thing we call the cluster role. We are going to do both of it. The cluster roles are the roles that is used outside, that is used within the cluster. But roles are used within namespaces. So if you create a role inside a namespace, you can't use it in another namespace. And I'm sure we understand the principle of namespace for those that don't understand. So we have talked about this in our previous classes. So we have talked about namespace and we have talked about a lot of principles. So if this is your first time, some things might be strange to you, but just need to go over the previous video to be able to understand where we are. So this role we're talking about work inside a namespace. So if you don't give it a namespace, that means it's going to create in the default namespace. Also the role binding, when you bind it. So now let's look at this. Take this role as an example. Now, if you should look at this role, this is the API. Now I said 4 things are important. Here now, API version, which is this is the role-based authorization. Then what is the kind? We are creating a role. It might be a cluster role. It might be cluster role binding. So we are going to get there. So what we are creating is a role. And when you come to the metadata, you can see that they give it a namespace here, which is the default. And what is the name of our role, which is the pod reader. Now, this is the rules they want to give to it. So these rules, this is the rules that is going to happen. So under that rules, we have what we call the API groups. So we can decide to put them in groups. So this is when we are using, if you have a core API, so you can put this under that, the name of the API that you are using. So if you are not using API groups, you can just leave it empty. That's why you can see this is empty. Now, the question is, which of the resources is this rule associated with? And that's okay. Oh, this rule, we want to use it on pods. So anybody that has this role can be able to get pods. They can watch pods. They can list pods, but they cannot what? They cannot create pods because there's no create here. So the only thing anybody that have this access, the only thing they can do is to get the pods that is running inside that namespace. They can watch the pods that is running inside the namespace, and they can they can list the pods that are running inside the namespace. But for them to be able to create pods inside that namespace, then I must add create here for them to be able to create. If this is the role this is the role access role I gave. So the person that have this access role cannot create create a pod. So maybe I want to create other resources, maybe like service. I want to create persistent volume claim, although so I have to put it here. So note in this type, I can't put persistent volume here. Why? Persistent volume works in what? In the cluster, not inside a namespace. So persistent volume cannot be part of the resources I'm going to create with role. If I want to create a persistent volume, that is when I will going to use a cluster role to create persistent volume. Let me check. Okay, this will take time. So let me just use that one to explain. So that is the role. So you can see here, we have the cluster role. They are the same thing, just that they are used in different ways. Like the role I said is used in what? It can only be used in what? In the namespace. And cluster role can be used in the whole of the cluster. So you can create a cluster role and use it anywhere inside the namespace or outside the namespace. So they still follow what? The same principle. So now this is cluster role, just the same thing. Secretary that does the same thing. So what we are saying here is that for all secrets inside the old cluster, if you have this access, you can get, watch, and list. But what this role is, you can see that there is nothing like namespace here. You can see what they wrote here. It said namespace omitted since cluster role are not namespaced. So, but the difference there is that you can see that namespace is here. So what this one is saying that I can also use this. I can also use these resources and verb here too. That means I'm saying that you can only on secret, you can only get, watch, and list secret inside the namespace. So that's why you can see that. So don't confuse them. I ask you to creating a cluster role is created from creating a role. So if you can create a cluster role and put it inside the namespace, it will not work. And if you create a row without namespace, it will assume it to be what? To be default. It will just put the default namespace. So that's cluster row. Then after we go with the cluster row, then we have what we call the role binding. So now what is this role binding? Remember before, the first thing we do is to create our service account. So when we create this our service account, okay, we have this service account or user account, any of it that we create. Once we create it, then the next thing is to create a role. So the role is the access. Okay, this is the access that I want to give for this role. And after we create this role, now we have to bind it to what? To a service account that we created. So that is what we call the role binding. So if you should look at this template for role binding, you see this is the API version, but the kind is what? Different. So now this is role binding. We have what we have role. For role, we use role binding. For cluster role, we use cluster role binding. So don't convince it. For role, we use the role binding and it is what? Namespaced. But for cluster role, we use cluster role binding. So here now, this is the binding we use for role. You can see that it has its namespaced. This is the name of the role binding. So inside the subject, we said that we want to attach this to a user, like maybe developer one now. That's the kind, this is the user, developer one. What's the name of the developer? Jane. So this is the API. This is normally like the default API. If you have any question, just ask if you don't understand, so you can go over it again. So you don't need to, wait, you can Google over. So now we said that from here, what we are saying that the kind that we are creating here is the user. So while creating the user, the name of the user is what? Jane. So this Jane is in this default API what? API group. And inside this API group, now we want to now reference the role that we created at the initial. So the role that we created initial, now we want to role reference. You can see this is the role reference. So when we do the role reference, we say kind role. Then the name of the role, remember the name of the role that is stated here, if I go up, is pod reader. So that's what they are referencing here. So we say that the role ref, okay, it's not this. So the role ref row, then the name is the what? The pod reader. And this is the API group that was given to it. So what we are seeing here, we want to bind this row, we want to bind this row to this user. So adding it is service account that we want to do. So instead of putting user here, we're going to put a service account. Then we put the name of the service account that we created here. So the same thing applies to, we are just use another example, this namespace development, this and this. So, okay. So now, so I think at the same time also, you can use the role binding to, you can bind all it also with a what? A cluster role. So what Simon is saying that maybe you create a role, you created a cluster role, it's inside the whole cluster. Once you create the cluster, it's inside the whole cluster. But you have already created, you want to want your maybe a pod inside a namespace to use that cluster. The cluster will add say the power over the whole cluster. So just like it's outside, then you want something that is inside to come and get access from the one that is outside. That one is also possible. That is why you can see there that we're using this kind of role binding to bind a cluster role because it is in the cluster. So the third one here is creating the cluster role binding, which is works for what? Only cluster what? Cluster roles. So that's why you see that here, kind here is cluster role. These are the name. Then we want to, which of the role we want to give reference to? That is the cluster role. And this is the name. Then this is what the API group then they are. So all this we can create it also using, I told you there is declarative way, there's imperative way. So what you are seeing here is the declarative way. You will use a template to create it. And trust me, you have the whole time in the exam to be using the what's it called, the declarative way. So we are going to create this also in our imperative way. So we are just waiting for our cluster to be up before we do this. So now let's go and check our cluster and see. Oh yeah, our cluster is up. So let's go to our cloud formation. You can see it's here. Let's go here and refresh. So we won't see anything here because we are in US1. So let's go to US2 region. So you can see that Kubernetes weekend is up. This is version, is using version 1.22. That is what is using. So now let's go to our VS Code. Okay. So you can see here now that it has already selected the context. Kubernetes weekend. This is my IAM user. This already giving us the context. So get nodes. You can see these are the 3 nodes. This is the IP of each of the nodes that was created. They are all ready now. So now let's do something. Oh, okay, this will be messed up. Okay, so now let's try and get all the context here. Cool config, get context. You can see that before we have 3 contexts. This is the one we just created. We have Docker desktop, we have the minikube. Those are the 3 contexts we have now, and presently we are using this. So now let's do get pods. You see that we don't have any resources there. So let's do get namespace. Now you see that we have get namespace, right? We have like this namespace. So this one is the default. This one is the kube node. This one is the kube public, and this is the kube system. So now these are the default names. These are the namespace that is used in creating all this cluster. Once this cluster is up, this namespace are what being created. And okay, let's do something. Get or get pods in all. That means in all namespace. Now, remember that when we did Docker desktop, we check something like this too. When we try to check when we check our proxy. This is the kube proxy. This is the DNS. This is AW. This is our. This is going to be our what's it called? So it's going to be like our API, AWS node. So this is going to be our API, like the one we have in our Docker desktop. We have the API. So this is probably going to be the port for that. So let's do something. Okay, get ports in our namespace. Let's do kube system in YAML file. So let me copy this. Okay. Let me copy this. Oh. So when we try to get what is inside of this pod, so now this is a daemon set. So that's what I'm trying to look for. So now this is how this works. Now AWS use a daemon set. You know, I said if you're in last class, I talked about daemon sets. That daemon set creates a single instance on each of what the node. So they use a daemon set to create this. So it's going to create that instance on what? On each of these nodes. So that's why you can see that the kind is what? Is daemon set. So now let me now do something now. Since I know it's daemon set, if I do get daemon sets in kube system, do I get the spelling correctly? Okay, let me just copy it. Yeah, I think I got it correctly. Easy, let me just, okay, I think, okay. Okay, so now if you should check the daemon set now, you can see that we have what? AWS node, and we have what? The kube proxy, which is the daemon set. So I want to check something here. So daemon set is used to what? To deploy this. So if you check here, so inside that daemon set, these are the environment that is being added. These are the national disk. These are the environment variable. If you remember when we did the environment variable, this environment variable are put in the daemon set. And now, if you remember when we are talking, we said that all this API server, the kube controller is being controlled by what? It can use is also deployed as a pod, like a static pod. So that's exactly what is happening here. Also, like something I want to check here. So these are the month part that each of this is being month on. This is where the CNI is month on. Okay, so let's check something. Okay, so now let's try to create different namespace here. Let's just create namespace. Okay, create namespace. Let's say part 1. What's happening? Okay. Namespace part 1. So let's create part 2. part 3. So okay, get namespace. We have this namespace part 1, part 2, part 3. So inside our folder, inside the last one we did, I think we have something like this. So let's check what is inside this folder. Let's check what is here. So let's check what is in. Oh no. So let's check what is inside our YAML file here. Okay, this is a deployment, an Nginx. Okay, so let's create this deployment. Let me check something again. I want to check if there's a namespace in the different okay, you don't have any namespace there. Okay, so let's create this. Okay, create this deployment in the namespace. Let's say part 1. Okay, get ports, nothing. Okay, get deploy, nothing, because we are not in the namespace that we created this folder. So let's go and get the ports in the namespace part 1. So you can see this one are running. This one are running. So now let's do something. Okay, get nodes. So take for example now this node, you want to go inside this node. Let's say SSH. Now it's okay. Okay, we have not got this service. Okay. We should okay, let's do something. Okay, we'll come to this. I know what happened to this, but let's go with all our deployment and finish all our deployment first. Then we'll come and SSH into each of the node. So now, when you are doing maybe let's say we are doing CKS, when you are talking about the security now, you have to go inside each of the node to apply some configuration, so that some ports will be able to use some configuration, especially when you want to scan your image. Because here now, if you should look at the definition file, you just say, okay, go there and just bring this image and use this image to create a container and color. So what if this image here, maybe it has some patches that cannot, like just like the hackers, they add some patches to it that they can be able to get into our pods, into our container. So that is why what security is always one of the most important and essential things when it comes to Kubernetes. But excuse me, I don't know if you are going to have enough time to go into the security parts of this, but let's just go to what we're doing. So now we want to create another thing in another namespace. So let me check this file. Let's check what is there. These are the deployments we have created in the past. So just want to use that. So this is space. So let's use this and edit it. So let's just change this to part 2. because that's the namespace. We don't have first namespace. Part 2. So now let's try to create this definition file. It's created in our what? It's created in our namespace get ports in all. So I want to show something now. So okay, you don't need to use all. Okay, get ports in namespace part 1. For example, I don't know if this is a good idea, but let me do it first. I want to so that we can able to see this clearly and boldly. Okay, so you can see this is the name of the deployment. We have what we call the name of the deployment here. Then here you can see this. Okay, this is the name of the deployment. This is showing the ready state, status, restart, age, IP. So this one is now telling us which of the node this deployment is on. I don't know if you understand this. You know this. Okay, let's do something. I want you to understand something here. Okay, get nodes. Looking at this node, we know this 1, 2, 3. This is the IP. Just look at the IP here. This is 222. This is 105. This is 21. So this deployment, which is the first one, is what on this what? On 105 on this node. You can see this is the node. This is the second node. And if you check the third node, 21, this is the third node. So that means each pod is running on each of the node. So what if I want to do it like I want all these pods to run in just a single node. So you have not even go back to our rules. I just because we create a new cluster, so I want to explain some principles that we have done in the past. So if you remember, when we talk about scheduling, when I was talking in my previous video that we're going to use this to work on multiple nodes. Okay, let me go back. Assigning ports to node. So now, I know this node is created. Now all this node, we want one to be the master and the other to be the what? The worker. So what we are going to do, the first thing is, okay, let me go back. So let me use this principle to explain this scheduler. So now we have 3 nodes, but all of them, there are ports on them. They are working, there are all ports on them. But I want to make one, what? The master, and the other one, and the other 2, I want to make them the worker. I want to, okay, let me just go to taint and toleration. Taint and toleration. So the first thing we are going to do is, on this node, we are going to apply what? A taint and toleration to it. What do we really want? I'm trying to check the time. So we have like 30 more minutes. Okay. Now, what we are going to do is what? We are going to do on each of these, we are going to put taint and toleration on one of the nodes, so that the pod will not be able to be scheduled on it. So whenever we do the deployment, the pod will be scheduled on others. So we won't have time to run. Let me just show you another ways in which I want to try to keep the time, and I've not gone to our roles and role binding. So let me just quickly do this so we can go to our roles and role binding. So assigning ports to node. So let's assume I want to deploy a new port now, but I want you to attach it to a what? A particular node. So that's where I'm going to use the word node selector and I'm going to use the word node name. So this is what I'm going to do. I want to show you in documentation. So let's assume this is deployment that we want to deploy. Is it here? Okay, now. So what I will need to do is inside the container, I will put the word, the node name. Yeah. So now let's try and do that and replace our definition file that we already deployed and see. Remember that we deployed we do a deployment earlier, this, right? So this deployment, we want to replace this deployment file. So let's open it in our text editor and we are going to create it again. So now inside this my container, I will have what is called node name. So if I put my node name here, oh, okay, we still need to go and copy one of them. So let's assume I want to put it only on this word, on this node 22, copy. So I come here and I put the node name. Okay. And I put the node name. Now, let me go and replace this file. I think I created it in part 1 namespace. Okay, replace F, force this in part 1. I think so. So our force need to come before our F. Okay, so that means we have issue with our indentation. This should be under this, okay. So let's just edit our YAML file again. Where is it placed? Node name is here. Oh, okay. It shouldn't be here. So let me just yank it. Then come here. Okay, you can yank it again. Let me just copy this. Copy. Paste it here. Oh, okay. I think I mistakenly do this. Yeah. So this, let's remove this. Okay, I think this looks good. So let's try again. So we have deleted the first deployment and we create a new deployment. So let's do our kget ports in our namespace of part 1 again. You can see our port is running now. So let's do write more information on it and see. So let's see. So when you look at it very well from this part, you can see this is the IP of each of the what, each of the port. Then look at the node here. Now the node is now scheduled on what? Only, you can see 22, 22, 22. is only on that node. Whereas when we did this, we have it in different nodes, 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. So each of the pod on each of the node. But each in here now, we have all the pod on one single node. So with this, like if you want, so with this now, we can make one node our master and the other one our worker. So one node will be the one that we have all our API configuration. We have our policy, we have our etcd. I'm going to install it on one of the node there, and we are going to what taint it. We are going to put a taint on the node, and other the pods that we want to create, like the API server that I want to create as a static pod inside our node, we have a toleration on it so that it can only go on that node. It's going to be the master, and other two will be going to be our worker. So that is how we are going to we make our nodes workers and what when we create a control plane and a worker nodes or master nodes and worker. So I just have to quickly do a recap based on what we have done in the past, because we are creating a new cluster now, which is 3 nodes cluster. So now let's quickly go through our security when we talk about the service account, RoleBinding and co. So remember that now let's start by listing the service account that we have here. So of course, we are going to have a default service account, get SA. So shortcut the service is SA. Service account is shortcut. So you can see default. So now let's see what is there. The service account. Let's see get service account in a YAML file. So this is the service account that is there. This is the secret file. This details about the service account that is there. So now let's create our own service account. So create essay. What's the name of our essay? Let's name it part 1, or let's just name it first. So if I do get essay, you can see that we have what the first service account here. So now when we create our service account, so let's try and create what? Let's try and create, this is in, okay, let's do something again. Yes, let me show you something. Now we create service accounts, 2 different service accounts now. I create another account called first. So when I do get SA in all namespace, but what I did, I created one in default namespace. I created the other in what? In a specific namespace. Now, when I do get service account in all namespace, so each of these has their own service account, which is default. They have their own service accounts. So, but this is the one I created. I created. So, in part 1, we have a default. Each of the namespace I created has what? Has the service account. So that's why I say part 1, the namespace has a default, part 2 has a default, part 3 has a default. So now in part 1, I created one which is first. And at the same time, in the default namespace, I created another one which is first. Can you see it is there? So now let me just delete the one that is in our namespace. I'm just giving an example of, you can see that it's in different namespace. So let's do delete SA first. So it's going to delete the one in our default namespace. So if you should check again now, we still have this one in our part 1, but if you check our default namespace, it is gone. So now let's try and create a role. So if you want to create a role using the imperative method, the other one I showed us is declarative method. By going there, copy template, I can easily get the template on my command line instead of going to the documentation. So I do create. Create role help. So it's going to give me the definition of how I'm going to create this role. You can see and all the flag I need to create. So now let me just copy this. So let me copy this. So now this is telling me that, okay, create role called pod reader. So what is it I want in this pod reader is to get, I can only get the pods. Let's say get list, create, and watch. Let's just say, okay, this is what we want to give to this. Oh, okay. It's even there. Verb, sorry. So we have the verb list. We have verb word. You can give it as many as we want. So we have already included the verb. Let me add another verb. Let's say equals to, we do get, list, watch. Let's do create also. Create. So which of these resources, pods? So now it is pods, right? Let's create it in a namespace. Let's say namespace of part 1. Let's do it like this. I like writing this in full. Equals to part 1. So pod reader, we are creating this one in namespace part 1. Oh, sorry. I want to do something before I create it, but I can still do it. So I want to do, let's do a dry run and see what we are creating. Let's check the template. Dry run equals to client. So now this is the template of what we created now. So we said this is the API version of this. This is the kind. So this is the metadata. You see the namespace is there. So this is the rule. So we didn't give it an API group, so it's default, but this must be there. If it's not there, it will just tell us error. So we are not telling this is the resources only on pods. So anybody that have this access can only what? Get, list, watch, and create what? Pods. That's what this is saying. So if you do get row, get rows in our namespace part 1, right? So pod reader, we have it here. So now let's again go and create a role binding. Now creating a role binding, we use the same method, role create role binding help. So we can see how do we create a role binding. Kubectl creates role binding, then we put the name, blah, 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 blah. So let's copy one and try that. Create role binding. This, okay. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. So now, do we have a group? No. So let's remove this. Now, we say create role binding. Let's give it the same name as our pod reader. Pod reader. That's the role binding name. So now, what is the cluster role? What is the name of the cluster role that we created? This is the role of this is the cluster role that we created. You can remember it's pod reader. So yeah, it's like what's the name of the cluster role, which is pod reader, is asking us, okay, what is the name of the cluster role that I want me to bind? They're like, okay, well, I want you to bind, create a binding, go binding, call pod reader. Then it will now ask us that which role do you want me to bind it to? Say, okay, we'll bind it to this role called pod reader. So if you bind this together, then who is going to use this? Who is going to use this? What's it called? This role that you want me to bind? Is it a user or a service? So if it is a user, it will be the user. Then what is the name of the user? Maybe Jane. But in our case, we created a service account. So we want a service to use it. We say service account. So when we are creating a service account, we put in the namespace that the service account is. So this is namespace. What's our namespace? I think it's first, right? So namespace first. Then we now put in, we said namespace. We said our service account equals to defaults, which is the namespace. I mean, part one, sorry. Part one, which is the namespace. So after we put in part one, then we now put in our service account name. So this is it here. This is the usage. Kubernetes create role binding, the name of the role binding. What is the role name? Then you say, what is it, a user or is it a group? That's why I say you can put a group name or user. But in this case, we are using service account. So it's a service account. What's the namespace? So what's the namespace? The namespace is what? The one we created. Service account, which is part one, and the service account name is first. So let's create this. So I think we made a mistake. You saw this thing. We make a mistake here. Let me check. Service account equals to namespace, and the namespace is this. Okay. We have the service account equals to part one, then the namespace first. Okay. So now you can see that the role binding has been created. So now let's go and get get roles in our namespace part one. You can see this is the pod reader. So let's do the same thing. Let's get our role binding. Oh, okay. So our role binding to wait a minute. Do we create a cluster role binding? Just so you know. Let me check the cluster role binding that we have. Okay. So there's nothing like that. So create role binding. Okay. Get role binding. Okay. So now what happened here? Let me check the command here. So when we create our, what's it called? Our role binding. So our role binding is created in the default namespace. So that's why when I did get role binding, we have it in the default namespace. So that's why I have a role binding here, which is created 76 seconds ago. Okay. So what I want to do now is to create a pod that is going to use this role binding. Let me just use any definition, any of the definition file we have here. Let me just check here. Or we can just do this krun let's give it a name. Role. That's the name of the pod. Role pod. Image equals to, let's say, engine X. Then namespace. So we do a namespace to be equals to part one. Okay, let's do dry run and see what we have there. In YAML file. What's this? Okay, so we do the dry run. So inside our dry run, we get the template of what the pod that we want to create. And if this looks good, so we can just go ahead and create. We can go ahead and create it. Oh, sorry, I wanted to add the service account, but let me just delete this. Okay, delete pods. This in what? In our namespace at 1. So we can delete the pod. So like this, we can redirect it to a new file. Let's say raw pod. No. So we can redirect it to raw pod.yaml. So if we should fill our raw pod.yaml. So inside our container, we can add. So we just come here. We want to use our service accounts. So if you don't know how to write, just come to documentation, go to service accounts. So configure service accounts for pods. So under the spec, what you need to do is this. So we copy that, then we go to our document, our terminal, come here. Oh, we check our indentation. So we put in our service account, which is what first. Then we apply this. Part 1. So this is the one we created now. So we can see that it's running. So it has a service account. So now let's try to edit it and see. Let's describe it. Let's do K describe pod. What's the name? This the namespace of part 1. So now looking at this, we can look at this the namespace. So you can see this is service account. So this pod is using this service account. So that is how you create like a role binding and service accounts. So the same thing also work for when the same way. So let me just show you. If you want to create a cluster role, so you do a k create. Let me clear this. So we do k create cluster is just exactly the same thing. You do cluster role help. So just like where we create our roles, just the same way k create. Let's check an example up here. K create cluster role. This is the name. This is the action we want it to do, and this is the resources we want it to work on. You can have as many resources as you want. So this is the resource name. You can have different resources and different resource name. So the same thing happens when you want to create role binding, cluster role binding. Just like we created it, the only difference is just what this. And if it is to create user instead of service account, you will use what user instead of what service account. So that is how you create this. So there's one thing I quickly want to show us before the time goes is security context. How to apply security context. So you can apply security context both at the container level and the pod level. Now, when you're talking about security context, we are like, which privilege am I giving to this pod? Which privilege am I giving to this container? Who are the people I'm giving the privilege to access this pod or to access this container? That is what you know as a security context. Now, how do we include this security context? What is this security context? So there are three ways in which you can use this when you want to put in a security context. You can use it as a user. You can run it as a group. Let me see if it's here in the documentation. Okay, so it's not there. Let me just. So like this second profile, it is very important when it comes to security. You have to apply this second profile, second profile in our container. So all this is here, but this is what I want to show us. So if you want to put in a security context, either for the container or for the pods, so this will determine the privilege that you want to give to the pod or the container that's running inside the pod. So the first one is this, it's a run as user. So you can run this pod as a user with this user ID. Or when you have this group ID, excuse me. And at the same time, if it is inside, if you look at this, this is being run at the pod level. But here also, we can run it inside the container. When you can put, maybe you want to, this will be the user ID that I want to run this. And okay, this example, you can see this rule can work in the pod, and at the same time, it can work inside the container. So you have security context both inside the pod and inside the container. It's not necessarily you have it inside the pod. You can just have it inside the container. So this part of the security when it comes to applying security to your pods and container. So I want us to go also to network policy, and which is one of the most important parts, but I don't think we can go through that. Let me just give a brief about that now. So this talk about networking in our pods and in the container. So there we'll be talking about ingress and outgress, what we want, the only traffic we want inside this pod, and the traffic we want out of the pod. For example, you don't just want any traffic inside your pod that contains your database. So you should be able to control both the ingress and the outgress of the database or any of your pods or your container. So that's why that network policy is very, very important. You know, when talking about cyber security, cyber crime and stuff, when an hacker wants to access into your container, you know everything now. Now most of everything we have on our website is migrated inside the container. So an attacker is thinking of a way in which you're going to hack your container, hack into your pod, and get your information. So for him not to be able to access this is why you have to control the network policy. So there are many ways in which an hacker can get inside your cluster. He can get hold of your cluster. There are many ways. So one of the ways to control them is using of a network policy. Another one is using of security context. So these are all part of what we are going to use in controlling the cluster. So by next class, we are going to go into, we are not able to finish it today, we are going to go into network policy. So before we quickly go, let me just explain resources. I think I skipped it in previous classes when you're adding resources. So now when you're adding resources, that's when you are talking about the quota. Let me just open it. It's also very important. So when we are adding quota to your pod, like how many CPU requests do you want? What is the memory request? Okay, this is not there. Just a minute, let me see. Resource management. Okay, so this is what I want. So inside your, maybe in your pod or deployment, when you are writing your definition file, there is what you call memory and limits. So this is the resource. So this, when you call this is the request. This is the one that you want to request, which is, in my previous slide, I talked about this MI. I talk about M. So there are two different things. So this is the memory, just like in your computer, you have this particular memory. This is your memory, this is your CPU, which is the request, that this is what this pod is requesting. Then it's like this is the limit, that this is the maximum that this pod can request. When your pod is going, it's going to request a particular memory, depending on how heavy your pod is. It's going to request memory, it's going to request CPU. So you can say, okay, now this is the request this pod is going to give, is going to be requesting, but this is the limit, this is the maximum that this can request. You see, yeah, we have different container inside this pod. This is the first one. This is the CPU request and limit. The same thing, we have the CPU request and limit. So you have to define it also, because when you are in production, you have to define the limit, the memory that your container will be using. That is where this is very important. So I think in our next section, we will move on and continue to talk about network policy. Then we'll go into networking. That is when we call about our code DNS and co. So hopefully we are going to finish that tomorrow. Let's see. So today I will end this section and we'll continue tomorrow. Thank you for joining.